With most mirrorless cameras, we can choose between a mechanical, electronic first curtain and electronic shutter. The mechanical is the one that still makes noise, brings this so-called shutter shock, and is a part that can have some wear and tear and eventually fail. So why do we still use it? Well, it still has some advantages, and in this video I want to cover the different advantages and disadvantages of the different shutter types, especially for nature and wildlife photography. And since many of you ask me when do you use which one, well, it depends a bit on the camera that you use, but also on the situation out there. So I just want to share my experiences, how I decide whether I use the electronic shutter, electronic first or mechanical shutter, and hope to give you a bit of a guideline. Let's start with the classical one, the mechanical shutter. As the name suggests, it's a mechanical curtain that is on mirrorless cameras basically open, so that I have a live feed of what's happening on my display or the viewfinder. As soon as I want to take a picture, the curtain closes quickly, it opens again, letting the light in, making the exposure, and then closes again after, well, you maybe guessed it, the time that you set as your shutter speed. So it is open for a thousandth of a second, a 2,000th of a second, whatever. Some of the disadvantages of the mechanical shutter are that it generates quite some noise. How much depends a bit on your model. It can also cause some vibration, also known as shutter shock, which can lead to a bit slightly blurry images. It's usually not terrible, but it depends if you're in a range with a longer shutter speed. I would say usually between 1/20th and 1/60th of a second. Here you can really sometimes see a difference. You can even feel a bit how the shutter opens and closes. And if you track the birds in the viewfinder and you take a burst of pictures, you will also have this classical blackout that you also know from DSLRs. And this is also something that can just not be avoided because the shutter needs to open and close at some point. If I take a burst of shots, you can hear the noise. I need to say for many animals this is not a problem at all, but I had some birds that were a bit skittish and then flew off when they heard the sound of the shutter, so that can be a disadvantage. Another thing is that it's usually slower than the electronic shutter that we will cover a bit later. With my R5, for example, it shoots 12 frames per second in the mechanical shutter and 20 frames per second in the electronic shutter, so that's quite a big difference, and that's the case for many other cameras. The next shutter type I want to cover is the first curtain electronic shutter. It's kind of a hybrid between the mechanical and the electronic shutter. Basically the exposure gets started electronically, so again you have the live feed through your viewfinder. When you press the button, the camera will start starting the exposure electronically, so without the shutter closing and opening, but for finishing the exposure it will close the curtain. One disadvantage can be that flares or in general the bokeh in the background can look a bit weird or not so nice anymore if you use the first curtain electronic shutter paired with a high shutter speed and a very large aperture. I need to say, I know this just from reading from it and the manual and other sources, because in my type of photography, when I go with my 600mm f4, this is not happening. This seems to be something that is really more relevant if you shoot with large primes like a 85mm 1.4 or something like this, where you have a really large aperture. But for me, for wildlife photography, this was never an issue. Another thing that is a slight disadvantage with this shutter type is that, at least with my R5, this is very camera specific. Please check this on the specs of your camera or in the manual. But here the bit depth gets reduced from 14-bit of 13-bit, so I have a bit less dynamic range. Is this an issue? It depends. It's very important to realize that at least my R5 and most cameras are not able to record 14 bits at 1600 ISO or something like this. The last shutter mode is the electronic shutter. Here the whole exposure is done electronically, which means you have no moving parts, therefore no noise, except if you turn on an artificial sound for the shutter, but that's something else. And you have no vibrations, you have no wear and tear, nothing. Additionally, with many cameras, this is the fastest shutter type. As I mentioned, with my R5, I get up to 20 frames per second like this. With the R6 Mark II, for example, you get up to 40 frames per second, so it's really fast. On my R5, the dynamic range gets unfortunately reduced as well, and even more, so it gets reduced to 12 stops. Again, if this is important, depends on how much dynamic range I have in my scene, and again at which ISO I shoot. If I shoot higher ISO, I don't care so much for this. However, the biggest disadvantage of the electronic shutter is the so-called rolling shutter. And this is an effect where fast-moving objects basically get kind of distorted. Maybe you have seen this. The classical example is a fan that has the blades distorted. The feathers or the wings, the wingtips of the birds, the primary feathers, can be distorted because they move quite quick. Or if you pan and you have some trees or other vertical structures in the background, they tend to be a bit crooked. And I want to quickly explain you, without going too much into technical detail, how this happens. So if you shoot in the electronic shutter with really basically all mirrorless cameras, the sensor gets read out line by line. So it starts from the top, reads the first line, second, until it's at the bottom. And of course, this takes a bit of time. So if the bird moves very quickly now, the camera is basically too slow with reading out the sensor. So meaning it starts here, reads it out, the bird continues to move, and by the time the camera is finished with reading out the last line on the bottom of the sensor, the bird has already moved a bit. So this means it gets a bit distorted, which can look weird in some situations. Now, how bad this distortion is depends on how slow the readout of the camera is or how fast it is. And I attached below a link where you can find some charts where they tested the readout speed with different cameras. I hope you got an overview of the different advantages and disadvantages. Now to the question, which shutter mode do I use or would I recommend using? So, as I said, it depends a bit on the situation and on the camera. So first of all, if you have a stacked sensor, these are the ones that have a really fast readout speed. At the moment from Sony, this is the A9 series and the A1. From Canon, it's the R3. And from Nikon, the Z9 and the Z8. With these, you don't need to care about the mechanical or first electronic shutter. Just use the electronic shutter all the time. It gives you only benefits. There is no disadvantages, at least in nature photography, where you don't deal with multiple light sources, flashes, and so on. If you have a camera that has a relatively fast readout speed, and at the moment I would say this is mostly the R5 and the R6 Mark II from Canon, then I personally tend to shoot in the electronic shutter most of the times, just because of the faster frame rate that I get, and I have not many issues with rolling shutter. Sometimes I see some horizontal banding in the tip of the wings of the birds, but I just prefer to have more type of wing positions that I can get. So I tend to stick there, except if I need more dynamic range. For example, in backlit in the morning, then I'm usually, if I have the flares and everything, there is so much light that I'm usually at 400 ISO or even at 100 ISO. I have a short shutter speed, so shutter shock is not an issue anyway. And then I might go back to the mechanical shutter just because I don't need the speed, and this gives me a bit more dynamic range, and that is in backlit sometimes really needed. Now, if I would shoot with a camera that has a slower readout speed, for example, the Canon R7, the Sony A7 IV, or say A7 R4, or the Nikon Z7 Mark II, then I would mostly shoot in the electronic first curtain, and mainly switch to the electronic shutter if you have subjects that are not moving fast, but you would like to have like a quiet camera operations because maybe they're a bit skittish. For example, with the R7, I also noticed quite a heavily wobbling when using my, especially my 600mm f4 lens. And this was also because of the slow readout speed in the electronic shutter. If I switch back to the electronic first curtain, I don't have this problem anymore. I hope this video was making some things clearer and was helpful for you. I would be very curious, which shutter type do you use the most? I made a small poll on my channel. You can click on there and we see the results. You can also just let me know in the comments if you made some positive or negative experiences with some shutter types. See you in the next video.